Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to the Coal Seam. This episode of the program is going to feature coal exports and my good friend Jason Bostic, who's dropped by the studio here. And hope you're doing a good day, having a good day rather. And we're going to get right into talking about the current status of the coal industry and the importance of coal exports to the state of West Virginia and to our country nationwide. Jason, thanks for coming by. Appreciate all you do and look forward to learning a little more about coal exports today.
Glad to be here.
I know West Virginia is a big international player as it relates to the export and utility of coal around the world. If I'm not mistaken, the state of West Virginia is a key driver behind U.S. exports, accounting for 1 out of every 2 tons, or approximately 50% of the U.S. total.
Yes, and that number has been going up over the last couple of years, and we've really seen in recently over the last 2 years a really dramatic shift. West Virginia has always exported metallurgical coal used to make steel to primarily markets in Europe. Europe's a natural fit for our coal exports because of the proximity. The blast furnaces and the steel industry in the countries in Europe are tailor-made to accept West Virginia coal to make coke, to make steel. But one of the
long-term relationship.
Long-term relationship. Been there throughout the years, even before the world wars.
Our infrastructure is designed to get it there. Their infrastructure is designed to use it and consume it within their country's power grid and power utilities.
Absolutely. The railroad system in West Virginia, the 3 major Class 1 railroads were primarily designed to move coal to the tidewater ports for export to Europe. But one of the interesting trends that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly over the last year, picking up again this year, are exports of thermal coal, just coal used to make steam and used to make electricity outside of Europe to the developing nations like India and like Africa. There's been, I believe, almost a 200 to 250% increase in the amount of steam coal that's left West Virginia headed for those countries.
So, for those viewers that may not be familiar with the types of coal we have or the distinction or difference between steam and met, we primarily have 2 types of coal here that's mined in West Virginia. It's all bituminous, but some of that bituminous is used to generate electricity, is burned by our coal-fired plants. And then there's a higher grade of coal that we typically characterize as metallurgical coal, and that's used for steel production.
Yes, sir. Yes, has a very, very distinct properties, and metallurgical coal is probably the most studied and analyzed product that we produce, because every single blast furnace or coke oven, whether it's domestically or internationally, almost custom blends coal to make coke based on the properties of their furnace or on the properties of the steel that they're trying to produce.
Very technical process.
Very complicated.
So we've been shipping coal all over the world for a long time, and the majority and most of that coal from a historic perspective has been met coal, used to, for coking and manufacture of steel around the world.
Yeah. And here over the last couple of years, we've seen a trend not only to the developing nations, but a large increase in steam coal exports to Europe, which is something we really haven't experienced probably since the end of the Second World War. And I think if you look at the trends in Germany and France, just to use those 2 examples, you had a big push after some high-profile nuclear accidents in Japan to deactivate the nuclear infrastructure to make electricity in those countries. And I think there was a belief that you could rely on renewable power to fill the void, and those 2 countries and a lot of other countries in Europe discovered very quickly that that's not the case. So you have Germany, France, other countries in Europe, even Poland, which produces and mines a lot of its own coal, that suddenly found themselves short on fuel supply and electricity supply for that matter. And West Virginia's coal, being high quality, high BTU, and also low sulfur, is a natural match to fill that void in that market. And we've seen just a huge increase in coal imports from West Virginia into Europe.
Exports.
Exports, I'm sorry.
Exports. You mentioned imports, and 10 years ago, maybe 12 years now. There was a time not too long ago when there was concern over the United States potentially becoming a net importer of coal. I mean, this is so hard to believe as we sit here today, but we were bringing in almost the same volume of coal that we were exporting. If I'm not mistaken, we don't have those numbers before us, but I believe we were only exporting, I want to say 32, 35 million tons of coal, and we're bringing into this country from places like Colombia, Venezuela, even Indonesia, 20-some million tons of coal.
Yeah, we were almost approaching the point of balance between imports and exports. And it was due, well, there was a coal shortage in this country back before the wave of power plant closures. And transportation difficulties, primarily with the railroads, to move the coal. It became easier for utilities to float it by deep water vessel to some of the southern ports from Colombia or Venezuela, offload it there, than it was to try to move it by train halfway around the country.
You know, I think we have seen some major changes in our, our nation and in the world energy mix, in a relatively short period of time. I mean, we've gone from I'll just throw, and you can respond to whatever you want, and then we'll get back on the topic of coal exports. But, you know, when you think about it, coal here just a few years ago was accounted for over 50% of the base fuel used to generate electricity in the United States. And today that number's down 28, 29%, right around 30.
30, and forecast to hover 30 to 33%.
I mean, that's amazing, that type of a shift, dramatic shift over a course of a decade. And a decade ago, we just talked, we were bringing in to the United States almost 30 million tons of coal from foreign destinations, and that's been totally reversed. I'm not sure. We might be bringing some traces of coal into the southeastern portion of the country from South America, but it's not very much.
No, I think it's around 3 or 4 million tons. It's fallen off to that level.
And then also, I want to make one other point. I think we hit an all-time benchmark or high in 2012 with our exports, and then it dropped off a little bit, and it's now recovered. But if I'm not mistaken, 2012, we were in over 100 million tons being exported from the United States.
Yeah, I think, Chris, this year, if you look at the numbers, are very encouraging that we may very well break the 100 million ton threshold. May break that record. The only limiting factor is probably the infrastructure to move the coal. The ports of export are probably running right at capacity or very close to it. Luckily, we do have a southern outlet in the Gulf ports where we can take coal by barge down the canal, down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, and offload or transload coal from a barge directly to a deep water vessel for export.
You think about it, most of the coal, high percentage, upwards of 80 or 90% of all the coal that is exported comes from the eastern coal fields. And when you think of West Virginia's output and our proximity to all the ports, the major ports in Mobile and New Orleans and Virginia, Hampton Roads, of course, and then there's Baltimore. I mean, we're central to all that. So I guess because of those two factors, our output and close proximity to the ports, it's no wonder we account for such a high percentage of all the coal that's exported.
It is, and I think the proximity and the fact that the infrastructure, when it was designed and built in the late 1800s by the railroads, was primarily to move coal to those ports. But the fact that our coal is such high quality, again, the low sulfur, higher BTU stuff, from a metallurgical standpoint, as you know, we've got the best coal in the country. But even the thermal coal for the developing nations is becoming so much more important. And they're hunting for the type of coal that West Virginia can provide them, the absolute highest BTU, along with lower sulfur quantities than what they can find in other parts of the country.
You know, our coal's always, I mean, it's always been regarded as high quality, some of the best quality of coal found anywhere in the world. And of course, we have, vast deposits of coal here. When you think about what the industry's experienced here the last decade and under the previous administration, I mean, we were ratcheting down domestic consumption of coal. And, over the past 7, 8 years, it's probably been a decade now when all that started. So a little longer than 7 or 8 years. But we went from burning over 1 billion tons of coal in this country down to today somewhere south of 700 million tons. Mm-hmm. So we've lost easily a third of our national consumption of coal. And while all that was going on, coal worldwide is the fastest growing fuel that's being relied upon to electrify those developing nations, and so that they are able to achieve the same, quality of life and lifestyle that we're accustomed to. Boy, it's just amazing when you think about that. And I think the fact that we're such a strong exporter, and were during, the 2010, 2011, and 12, continuing today, that shielded a lot of the devastation, or offset a lot of the greater devastation that we would have incurred as a state.
Absolutely. Had it not been for the strong export market, primarily metallurgical coal, instead of going from 160 to say 100 million tons, we could have conceivably gone down as low as about 50 million tons.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing when you think about that. Yeah. I don't think the average person really internalizes the importance of the export market to West Virginia coal and to our state.
Yeah, most people probably assume that, and it's very comfortable to do that, the coal trains that they see or the barges that they see are headed for power plants in this country. Mm-hmm. And in West Virginia's case, increasingly, those trains may very well be headed to one of the deep water ports for export to, say, Europe or India, mm-hmm. or in rare cases, even sometimes as far away as China.
And think of we're sitting here and, we sit in conference rooms and just sort of bat numbers back and forth. But, there's people associated with a lot of the work involved in export. I mean, it accounts for tens of thousands of jobs, all the transloading, the transportation, all the workers at these ports, that we name, whether it's Baltimore, Hampton Roads, or New Orleans. Then you have trains dumping barges and trucks. I mean, there's a real elaborate infrastructure that's at play every single day, getting the coal from McDowell County, West Virginia, to a destination in India or somewhere in the Netherlands or Europe or Italy. It's pretty remarkable.
It is, Chris, in the logistics of scheduling the trains and the individual carloads when the vessels are scheduled to dock at the ports. Some of the ports don't have ground storage for coal, so the coal is actually stored in the railroad cars until the vessels arrive. So the logistics of planning and coordinating the shipments of the coal, and especially with metallurgical coal, a lot of the stuff is blended at the deepwater port. Mm-hmm. So you have maybe 5 cars of coal from this train, another 5 cars of coal from this train, and it all gets mixed as it's loaded in the boat. Mm. The logistical aspects of that are just phenomenal. Every bit as complicated, maybe not as big and as complex, but every bit as complicated as, say, UPS or Federal Express.
Mm-hmm. No, you can see that, and I know exported coal, met coal carries a little higher premium, but there's a lot of money that is expended for all these ancillary tasks that have to take place. Mm-hmm. The coal's mined and is produced at X, but has to be divided and subdivided 8 or 10 times before it reaches its ultimate customer.
Yeah, and it has to be sampled multiple times mm-hmm. at the mine, in the railroad car, and if it's mixed at the deepwater port, it has to be sampled multiple times to make sure that the blend meets the specifications of the customers. really is an amazing logistics puzzle.
What does, speaking, going back to numbers, volume, what do exports, what do they account for today? What percentage of our state's mining is part of the export program?
Roughly, there's around 23 million tons total between metallurgical and thermal. When you combine those two, we're sitting right at about 23 million tons.
Okay.
And it increases every year. As you mentioned earlier, the closures of the power plants, which while the majority of those have already taken place, there are some still continue to go forward. So as the domestic consumption goes down, we see more and more of that, thankfully, again, for the state of West Virginia, for the tax revenues for those that work in the coal industry, we see the export numbers continue to go up. And the thermal coal exports are extremely promising, I think, because the metallurgical market, we pretty well know, because of the quality of the coal, that as long as the world needs steel, subject to the ups and downs of the world economy, that we have a large percentage of that market. Australia dominates the world metallurgical market for just in terms of production. The seams are thicker, they're easier to get to, and they're closer. Australia is closer geographically to the developing markets like Asia. But for the remainder of the world, we will probably have that met market, or a large percentage of it locked up. The thermal coal, once we lost the domestic consumption from the power plants, there was a big concern that facet or that aspect of our production and employment was going to be lost forever. So the thermal demand in these developing nations has been a real promising outlook for the future of the industry here. Because as you said earlier, we know that coal is the fastest growing fuel around the world. And the fact that the countries appreciate the quality of West Virginia's coal and the ease of its delivery, I think bodes well for us.
Boy, I tell you, this is real enlightening, and it it jumps out at me is that this is one aspect of West Virginia's coal mining industry that stands to encounter growth here over the foreseeable future, and it just appears that this is an area that maybe our state, the Department of Commerce and the executive and even legislature ought to become more knowledgeable of and provide some assistance to help us secure some of these and to grow some of these markets that are there. I mean, it's in everybody's best interest.
Couldn't agree more. Because international trade is, as you can imagine, is extremely complicated. Money exchange rates, shipping rates, things of that nature. And we as an industry, just like any other industry, not just coal, could use some assistance there. I'm sure it would probably benefit West Virginia to begin, when we have trade delegations to go to these various countries, to talk about coal sales or fuel sales offices in centrally located places in Europe, just to make sure that the rest of the world knows the portfolio of fuel, coal, and or natural gas when those exporting facilities are finished that we have available to meet their needs. We could definitely use some assistance on that front.
You know, I recall back reading, back when the country was going through the oil embargo and the long lines at the gas stations. And, it seemed then that coal through Jimmy Carter, President Carter's coal commission, domestic coal was given a real boost at that time. And there was a state coal commission, a coal development authority, I believe under Governor Rockefeller, maybe Governor Moore. And then, fast forward 15 years or so, there was a coal export council or coal technology council that was created here on the state level. Why some of those entities weren't sustained, I'm not sure. And I'm not suggesting that we create one, but maybe the time to take a hard look at this whole export, because I think everybody embraces trying to grow exports no matter what it is. It creates markets, it helps sustain an industry or business.
And here's one of the more important things, I think, from an international trade policy going forward, is the exporting fuel from the United States will help offset the absolutely ridiculous trade imbalances we have with some countries. I believe that's certainly a possibility, and I know that our president's concerned about the same issue. But a little bit of help, and just I think it would do everybody, especially in West Virginia, it would serve everybody well to at least examine the volume of exports, where they're going, how they're getting there, railroad, barge, transportation, just so we can assess the adequacy of the infrastructure. Again, based on the world's appetite for the fuel, the only thing that may ultimately constrain our ability to export coal is the limitations of the infrastructure, and whether the ports need expanded, whether they need some investment to allow for ground storage of coal, for example, so you get better turnaround on railroad cars or other things.
You know, I know some they were looking at some port expansion or creation out on the West Coast, different places, and you know there were environmental efforts, I believe, at play that were working against those initiatives. I'm not sure where any of that stands right now, and I think they were looking at some ports through the Great Lakes as well.
Yeah.
You know, just to try to, you know, to relieve some of that pressure with not being able to get the product, you know, the seaborne.
Yeah, the western ports are very promising for the coal production from Wyoming and the Powder River Basin, which is, as you know, is lower quality coal, but there is some market for that internationally. And they do have a real bottleneck because of transportation barriers, interchanges with different railroads, of moving their product to the international market. And most of the western port expansions have either been canceled or nullified by some act of the government. So the western ports have probably been put on hold. What we have seen, Chris, you mentioned the Great Lakes. We've seen an uptick, I think, to accommodate this growing volume of exports. The Great Lake export ports were on a downward trend in terms of the volume that moved, but as of the last 2 years, we've seen reinvigorated or increased exports through the Great Lake ports. Not just to Canada, our traditional trading partner, especially for West Virginia, but for departure ultimately to the Atlantic.
To the Atlantic from Canada. Makes sense. We're not alone. There's a number of other states that play in the export market, and we're all competing. You know, West Virginia is well poised to, you know, continue because of the location and quality of our coal. But there's still pretty fierce competition that we're looking at. I know a lot of coal from the state of Illinois is going right down the Mississippi and out Mississippi River and out you know, and out the Mobile and New Orleans ports.
Yeah, and the competition factor is always there, and especially with a commodity like coal, as you know, pennies matter. And if coal can be produced a little cheaper in Illinois and moved a little cheaper from Illinois to the ports, that's where the international buyers will turn. So even though the market's promising, I don't think we as a state or the industry in West Virginia can ever lose sight of the fact that we have to continue to stay on our path to reduce costs, contain costs, reduce costs, because the international market's every bit as competitive as the domestic market for power generation now, after some of the Clean Air Act regulations were implemented by the Obama administration.
We're down to about 95 million tons of state coal production, give or take a couple.
Yes, sir.
We've rebounded a little bit from the low of 84, 85 million tons 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2016 was one of our lowest years on record. But we went back up in 2017, 94, 95. Final numbers may ultimately come in closer to 100 million. And it looks like so far for 2017, we're on track to maintain about 100 million tons.
So this time a year ago, we were all very pleased to see an uptick in the market, not just primarily export, but a little bit of domestic. We saw a few new mines open. We saw some existing mines that had furloughed workers and cutbacks in work schedules and production schedules. We saw some of those operations recall some miners and resume some higher production levels. All that was good. People were hearing coal trains and coal trucks for the first time in some southern West Virginia communities that they hadn't heard or experienced in a couple years.
Yeah, a wonderful relief. And a lot of that just, through the production chain and overall for commerce from this country, we saw an increase in domestic metallurgical consumption. So that of course means we were making more steel in the United States, which is always a good thing, I think. And as the president continues to renegotiate trade agreements with the other countries, not just here in North America, but with China in particular, I think our domestic metallurgical industry has a little bit of room to grow as we make more steel here, and as blast furnaces are reactivated to meet that new steel demand.
Looking ahead, and I know we don't have a crystal ball that takes us too far into the future, but I understand that we will, in all probability, stay about where we are as an industry, which is still very substantial. And that's a point that I think continues to be made, because the industry is so often viewed as a dying industry, but even at our existing profile today, at 95 to 100 million tons, 20,000 direct jobs, 50, 60,000 indirect jobs. I mean, this is still a major industry and economic driver for our state.
Absolutely. It's the single most important piece of West Virginia's economy. And even at 100 million tons or 90 million tons, we are still the second largest coal producing state in this country. And we're the largest underground coal producing state in this country. So while we've lost some volume, and I think all the experts generally agree we'll never be back to our record highs of 160 or 181 million tons. 100 million tons of good, high-quality production is pretty important to the state.
Well, this is probably a pretty good place to stop. I really appreciate your time and you coming by here today and talking to us and briefing us on coal exports. Very, very important aspect of West Virginia coal, and it sounds like it's going to be more important as we go forward. So thanks so much. And I want to thank you for tuning in today to the Library television station, who's celebrating our 40th year this year of keeping the West Virginia citizens and state informed on important issues. Have a good day.